Most people assume modern agriculture relies entirely on synthetic fertilizers, chemical formulas painstakingly designed to maximize crop yield. That assumption is only half the story. In the mid-20th century, a single soil bacterium, later named Rhizobium, was capable of replacing entire industries of chemical fertilizer production. It fixed nitrogen directly from the air into the soil, naturally enriching fields without industrial input. For decades, this discovery transformed food security and agricultural strategy worldwide. Yet today, you cannot simply buy it in the open market, and few remember its wartime and post-war significance. This is not a story about a lab breakthrough alone. It is a story about the interplay of science, warfare, economic policy, and survival, the kind of history that shapes both human endurance and strategic decision-making. Understanding why this bacterium vanished from the marketplace teaches us as much about global priorities and preparedness as it does about soil and crops. This bacterium was discovered in a world still defined by wartime food scarcity. During the Second World War, Europe and Asia faced simultaneous crises of manpower, logistics, and food. Rationing was only the surface layer of a far more profound challenge: soil fertility. Traditional crop rotations and manure use could not meet the demands of growing armies and civilian populations. Chemists in Germany and the United States were racing to synthesize nitrogen compounds for explosives and fertilizer, often using the same industrial processes. It was in this environment that scientists turned back to the soil itself, searching for organisms capable of natural nitrogen fixation. The discovery of Rhizobium in leguminous plants, peas, beans, clover, was initially a scientific curiosity. Researchers observed that certain fields required little to no supplemental fertilizer, and yields remained surprisingly high. The key, they realized, was the symbiotic bacteria in the roots of these plants. The bacteria converted atmospheric nitrogen into a form plants could use, effectively turning air into soil fertility. During wartime, the implications were immediate. Areas cut off from imported fertilizers suddenly had a potential solution. Laboratories began mass cultivating strains of the bacterium, distributing them to farmers and, in some cases, military food programs. In occupied territories and resource-strapped nations, this microorganism was a quiet lifeline, subtle, invisible, yet vital. Its adoption reveals how war shapes agricultural strategy in ways often overlooked. The use of nitrogen-fixing bacteria was not uniform, nor was it without tension. Military planners and agricultural ministries were often in conflict over priorities. In Germany, synthetic ammonia production was prioritized for munitions, leaving fertilizer, well, pretty scarce. In the United States and Britain, by contrast, programs promoting Rhizobium inoculation were aggressively pursued in domestic and allied territories. Scientists were not simply producing more food, they were in fact reshaping the battlefield of agricultural policy. Farmers in rural France, Poland and parts of Eastern Europe experienced these programs firsthand. With labor shortages and disrupted supply chains, introducing nitrogen-fixing bacteria became both a practical and a strategic measure. Fields inoculated with these bacteria required less chemical input, allowed for multiple harvests, and, frankly, helped communities survive under occupation or blockade. In many cases, the bacteria directly contributed to civilian resilience in ways more dramatic than food drops or ration expansions, but the historical record treats these interventions as footnotes. The lesson for survivalists is striking. Understanding the biology of soil and leveraging symbiotic organisms can substitute for industrial inputs. In contexts of war, famine, or economic collapse, knowledge of such microorganisms is as critical as knowing how to preserve or store food. Ironically, the post-war agricultural boom made this bacterium less visible, not more. Governments, private industry, and international aid programs invested heavily in chemical fertilizers. Synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium could be produced at scale, standardized, and marketed globally. The invisible, living technology of nitrogen-fixing bacteria could not be patented in the same way, nor could it be controlled to generate profit on the level chemical industries demanded. As a result, Rhizobium inoculants became a niche product, largely restricted to academic, experimental, or niche organic farming contexts. By the late 20th century, most commercial farmers relied exclusively on chemical fertilizers, even in regions where natural inoculation might have sufficed. Political and economic decisions, rather than scientific limitations, dictated the decline of a tool that once mitigated fertilizer shortages. For modern viewers, there is an important survival lesson here. Technological adoption is rarely about efficiency alone. It is shaped by policy, market forces, and the perceived control of resources. What survives in widespread use is not always what works best for long-term resilience. The story of Rhizobium challenges the assumption that only large-scale industrial solutions can feed populations. During the war, the difference between inoculated and uninoculated fields was tangible. Communities survived where they otherwise would have struggled, and armies could rely on locally produced staples rather than imported fertilizer-dependent crops. Moreover, it demonstrates the subtle connections between science and military strategy. Feeding civilians and troops was as much a part of operational planning as logistics, intelligence, or weapons deployment. The weapons in this case were microscopic, but they produced effects measured in thousands of tons of crop yield in communities saved from famine and in regions that could resist occupation or blockade. For survivalists, or really anyone preparing for systemic disruptions, the lesson is clear: small, natural systems like soil microbes, seed diversity, and rotational crops can actually substitute for industrial infrastructure if they're understood and applied correctly. They require knowledge, patience, and timing, but, they're remarkably resilient when managed thoughtfully. Today, purchasing high-quality nitrogen-fixing bacteria as a commercial farmer is, honestly, more complicated than buying chemical fertilizers. Strains are tightly controlled for research, regulatory, and intellectual property reasons. Commercial inoculants do exist, but they're often low quality, localized, and, inconsistent. The shift from natural to synthetic solutions created a feedback loop. Industrial fertilizer infrastructure became dominant, displacing training, knowledge, and practical use of biological alternatives. This is not merely an agricultural story. It's really a story about access, knowledge retention, and, preparedness. Societies that lose touch with low-tech yet highly effective survival tools, whether microbial, mechanical, or biological, become dependent on global supply chains and, honestly, vulnerable to disruption. The bacterium may seem small, but the lesson is systemic. Resilience is often invisible, and you see history is full of examples where such subtle tools were decisive under pressure. When historians recount wartime agriculture, they focus on rationing, logistics, or policy failures. Very rarely do they emphasize the microorganisms quietly keeping fields fertile. Yet these microbes shaped decisions, mitigated scarcity, and, in their own way, indirectly influenced the outcomes of nations. Understanding their history allows modern survivalists, historians, and policymakers to recognize that resilience often lies in the overlooked or invisible. This is not nostalgia, it's a call to observe patterns, small, decentralized solutions, whether they're biological, technical, or social, can really multiply the effectiveness of scarce resources. They have the power to sustain communities when industrial systems fail. And their disappearance is rarely down to inefficiency. It's usually the result of policy, profit, and centralized control. If you study these stories carefully, they reveal quite a lot about the relationship between humans, their environment, and the technologies they end up adopting. They also shine a light on some very practical lessons for anyone interested in preparedness. A well-fed population does not only rely on fertilizer factories. It relies on knowledge, on maintaining biological systems, and on respecting the quiet agents of survival that history, quite frankly, tends to overlook. Rhizobium and its wartime history are reminders that even microscopic forces can shape survival, strategy, and history itself. They challenge our assumptions about progress, efficiency, and control, and, importantly, they teach us that resilience often resides in these overlooked systems, and that understanding them can mean the difference between scarcity and stability in a crisis. If you value thoughtful, deep historical analysis that connects human endurance, warfare, and survival, consider subscribing to Iron Age Instincts. Please share this video with others who want more than just surface-level history, and keep exploring the overlooked stories that have quietly shaped our world.